Next Senate election prediction video. Today is Saturday, July 18th. We are now just 108 days away. A week from tomorrow, we will hit the 100-day mark. Of course, that is generally when election season changes and changes permanently as a number of factors come into play. Both candidates almost always have their vice presidential pick by that time. Of course, Hillary Clinton, she named her pick on July 22nd of 2016. So we're basically waiting any day now for Joe Biden to make that determination as to who is going to be his selection to challenge Donald Trump and Mike Pence on the ballot in November. But of course, there are also 35 Senate races that are up. More than a third of the Senate is up for re-election in 2020. And as you can see, the majority of U.S. states have elections this go-round. This cycle, the Democrats are far more on offense than they were in 2018. And the Republicans are far more on defense, just as they also will be in 2022. And before we get started on these individual races, we should, for some context, give you a little bit of information about what you're going to potentially see in 2022, as there are very competitive, potentially, Senate races happening in North Carolina, just as there is one this time around. There's one in Wisconsin. There will be one in Florida, an open seat potentially in Iowa, depending on what Chuck Grassley decides to do, and in Pennsylvania, where Pat Toomey is also up for re-election. So Ron Johnson, Marco Rubio, Richard Burr, who's facing speculation and charges, whatever the determination has been to this point of insider trading, and Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania, along with Grassley. So with that in mind, it's pretty important that the Republicans hang on to these seats a little bit, as the Democrats are really only playing defense in just one seat, and that's New Hampshire with Maggie Hassan. So let's get into it. We'll start over here with Alaska. Now, this is an interesting state because Donald Trump is underperforming Dan Sullivan, the Senate candidate. And that says a lot, not just about what's happening in this state, but what's happening nationally to Donald Trump. Because if he's having trouble in the state of Alaska, whereas Dan Sullivan so far isn't against the independent candidate Al Gross, who's generated a little bit of buzz, as someone who's promised to caucus with the Democrats, etc., that suggests that Trump's approval rating is very low in the state of Alaska, and we also know it's very low nationally. He's consistently in the mid to low 40s and has lost basically every single poll, dozens and dozens and dozens of consecutive polls, to this point where it's over 100 consecutive polls that have him down to Joe Biden nationally. And so the mere fact that he is underperforming Dan Sullivan, a senator, an incumbent Republican senator who is very unknown nationally, doesn't have much of a standing in the national media, anything like that, that suggests that he is in a lot of trouble. But for Dan Sullivan's sake, this is the kind of thing where he's going to be able to edge out Al Gross, just because I think the Democrats are focusing their resources on better pickup opportunities such as Montana, Arizona, Colorado, North Carolina, Maine, Iowa, and maybe in Kansas as well, and Georgia. So for now, I'm still going to put this as a lean. I know some forecasters have this state as a tilt, but for now, after a poll that had Dan Sullivan up by 13 points that came out yesterday, I think it's safe to lean in and only a little bit. I think we're sort of I have it as a lean, but I think for now we're sort of leaning towards likely. I know that sounds weird, but that's where it stands right now. In the state of Oregon, now the Democrats, this is a little bit of an inconvenience for them, just because this is pretty much a safe state for them. But the reality is, Oregon is one of those states that is just, like the Republicans have just a big enough presence in the state, where they've had a senator within the last 15 years. And they have a just big enough presence in the state to where the Democrats do have to devote some resources here. But Jeff Merkley is going to be just fine, and I imagine this will be one of those states that the networks will call pretty much right at poll closing. So as a result, Jeff Merkley is listed as a safe seat. And as we know, I should have mentioned this earlier, but the Democrats have 36 seats now compared to the Republicans, who have 31. as each have retained one Senate seat to this point. In the state of Idaho, Paulette Jordan is a name that has generated a little bit of buzz in the Democratic Party, just as a black Senate candidate in the state of Idaho, which is pretty rare. But that doesn't mean she's going to come anywhere close to winning against Jim Risch. So that, there's really nothing to discuss there. It is a state that I think the Democrats should keep at least one half of an eye on, just going forward, because the city of Boise is growing down here in the southern portion of the state, and should one municipality in the state of Idaho grow really at all into even a moderately large city, that could change the dynamic here, just because it's still a very low population state. In the state of Wyoming, nothing to discuss there. This is probably the reddest state in the entire country. It's basically the Republican Party's Washington, D.C. The Democrats basically have no chance at all, really on any level in the state. Whereas in Idaho, there's at least, they can at least get a Democratic mayor of Boise elected. And, there's a gay community, a progressive community, but still both of these states very, very safe in the red column. Now, in the southwest portion of the state, this is obviously where the tipping point is going to happen a little bit. I know in some of the past Senate election videos, we kind of narrowed it down where we did some of the real safe seats first and then got, progressively more competitive. This time we're just going to go west to east, as you saw when we started with the state of Alaska. So let's do that exactly in the state of Arizona. Now, this has long been pointed to as one of the most competitive and potentially gettable Senate seats for the Democrats. Martha McSally is the incumbent, and if that name sounds familiar, it should, and that's because she ran in 2018 and lost to Kyrsten Sinema, and that alone showed that the Democrats were making some pretty significant inroads in the state after Donald Trump won by a smaller than expected margin in the state in 2016. And so as a result, Kyrsten Sinema was able to win, and by a little over a point, too. I mean, she was able to win. The race wasn't called on Election Day, but it wasn't, an absolute nail-biter either. She was able to pull away by the end of the race. Since then, Martha McSally has been appointed to the Senate by Governor Doug Ducey, meaning that she is now up for re-election again, and this time she's being challenged by Mark Kelly, who is, of course, the husband of Gabby Giffords, a former astronaut, a very good candidate for the Democrats, and so far there's still plenty of time left, 3.5 months, but there's basically no reason to believe that Mark Kelly is not going to win this Senate race. He is consistently ahead in poll after poll after poll after poll. That gives him a distinct edge to this point in the U.S. Senate. And if we just look here from Mark Kelly's perspective, let's just get the last poll added to 538 was on the 15th, 3 days ago. So if we just go down the list from Kelly's perspective, +7, +9, +4, +6, +8, +7, +7, +9, -4, +15, +9, +9, +13, +10, +13, +9, +3, +6, +12, +7, -2, +5, +7, +4. That's all the way back through January. So over the last 6 months, Mark Kelly has been trouncing Martha McSally. And because this is still a state that, generally in the past has tipped over to the right, that's not really going to happen this time. Okay, all polling data indicates that Mark Kelly is going to be able to win this Senate race, and that Joe Biden is going to edge out Donald Trump on the presidential level. And not to mention, that's obviously such a significant development on the presidential level, seeing as the state of Arizona is worth 11 electoral votes, and that's basically another Wisconsin. How much was made of the state of Wisconsin after the 2016 election. So the Democrats sort of have an extension of the Rust Belt in a certain sense here on the presidential level. But Mark Kelly is just continuing to surge ahead of Martha McSally. I would say this is right up there with Colorado, which we'll get to in a minute, as the most flippable Senate seats for either party, really. And as a result, I'm going to put this as a likely Democratic state. Now, obviously, a lot of forecasters like to list certain likely, lean, safe tilt characterizations based on the actual polling margin. That's not what we do here, of course, at this channel, as you know by now. Instead, we just eyeball it a little bit more in terms of how likely is it really a likely scenario or a lean, as opposed to where it actually stands at the moment, because things can change in 3.5 months, and some of the polling data and some of the fundraising data would suggest that this is actually a safe Democratic seat. But with 3.5 months to go, the Republicans still have the incumbency advantage. This is by no means some liberal, flaming blue state. So I have this as a likely for the Democrats. In the state of New Mexico, the Democrats actually don't have their incumbent running, as they have a retirement here in this seat, but Ben Ray Lujan currently leads by a lot in the polls. New Mexico has shifted further and further to the left over the last 15 years. Still can be characterized by some models as a swing state, but it's pretty safe on the presidential level for the Democrats. And on the Senate level, Ben Ray Lujan is probably going to be just fine. Of course, this was also one of the states that the Democrats were able to get 7 governorships flipped in the 2018 midterms, the others being Nevada, Kansas, Michigan, Wisconsin, Maine, and Illinois. I think that's all 7, counting New Mexico. And so for now, Ben Ray Lujan should be fine. There could be a poll here or there that shows the Republicans, having at least somewhat of a chance, but don't expect that. I would expect Ben Ray Lujan to win by double digits, if not more. Now in the state of Colorado, remember the Democrats have already picked up 1 Senate seat here, so this is a big one here in Colorado. Of course, this is another state that generally has that kind of swing state designation, although as we all know, this is a state that generally tilts, if not leans, Democratic. Barack Obama won it both times. Hillary Clinton, who, as we know, was not a very liked candidate, not a very popular candidate, and managed to lose to one of the most, if not the most unpopular president in American history. She still won this state, and by a comfortable enough margin. Meanwhile, Cory Gardner is the Republican incumbent. And one of the states that we'll get to later, Alabama, Cory Gardner is as, if not even more, vulnerable in Colorado than Doug Jones is in the state of Alabama. So John Hickenlooper, who ran briefly for the presidency, was the #1 recruit for the Democratic Party to challenge Cory Gardner for this seat. He's the former governor of the state, very popular governor, moderate Democrat, sort of known as a conservative Democrat. Of course, there was a lot of chatter early on in the president's term of Hickenlooper teaming up with former Ohio Governor John Kasich to sort of form the split party ticket. You sort of had a moderate Republican and a moderate Democrat teaming up for a ticket that would challenge Joe Biden, or rather Donald Trump. But instead, Hickenlooper decided to run for president on his own. That was a short-lived race, and now he's running for the Senate and is absolutely trouncing Cory Gardner. There were some hiccups in the Hickenlooper campaign. He got flagged by that ethics panel that he was fined for, and that got him written up in Politico as, I think the headline read, like, Hickenlooper's stumbles threaten Democratic majority or something like that. But that has since seemed to fade away a little bit as those violations occurred before the Colorado Senate primary against Andrew Romanoff, who many in the Democratic Party consider to be the far more progressive candidate. But Hickenlooper was able to ultimately defeat him by 20 points. So there's basically no reason to fear that Hickenlooper still does not have an overwhelming lead over Cory Gardner. And in fact, right now, the Republican Party is not even throwing that much money into this race, because they recognize how far behind they are. There hasn't even been that much polling conducted in this race. There's been there was one added on July 1st from Public Policy Polling that had Hickenlooper up by 11 points, but one back in early May that had him up by 18 points, one from Montana State University back that was conducted in early April that had Hickenlooper by 17 points. So a guy who's absolutely beloved in the state of Colorado. I think this is, even though, again, the margin might not ultimately pan out this way, this to me is a safe Democratic pickup, and that's really saying something for a state that has a Republican incumbent. For it to be a safe Democratic pickup says a lot about the state of the Republican Party, just in terms of their popularity. That's not a political statement on my behalf. That's just what the numbers tell us. And on, as we know, the southwestern portion of the United States is tilting to the left a little bit more with each year, just as the entire Sun Belt is, with the exception of Louisiana and Oklahoma, if you consider that the Sun Belt. And of course, Utah isn't really as well. But Colorado, New Mexico, and Arizona are three states that have definitely been shifting more to the Democratic side. And already here, they have two pickups. Remember, the Senate right now sits at 57 to 43. And now these two pickups, provided the Democrats defend all their other seats, are basically up to 49, even though we know Doug Jones is very vulnerable in the state of Alabama. Now in the state of Montana, this to me is the most fascinating Senate race of this entire cycle. Montana is such an interesting state on the political level, just in all forms of elections. Barack Obama came pretty close in 2008, captured over 46% of the vote in the state of Montana. There are a lot of sort of wealthy California types that own second homes up in Montana. Furthermore, there's a certain environmental consciousness, as we broke down in our last Senate production video, that gives Montana a certain left-wing, well, not left-wing, but a certain purplish tinge, if you will, in which Democrats can be elected. Of course, Max Baucus was a long-term Democratic senator from the state of Montana, a very beloved political figure in Montana. And of course, recently, Jon Tester, who was able to win re-election in 2018 in a year in which the Republicans flipped 4 Senate seats. You would have expected that one of them would have come from Montana, but it didn't. Instead, it came from North Dakota, Missouri, Florida, and Indiana, whereas Jon Tester hung on, just as Debbie Stabenow did in Michigan, just as Tammy Baldwin did in Wisconsin, Sherrod Brown in Ohio, and Joe Manchin in West Virginia. So right now, Steve Bullock, the very popular incumbent governor of the state of Montana, is running against Steve Daines, the incumbent senator. Steve Bullock is very interesting because he won re-election. He was up for re-election as the governor in 2016, and in a year in which the Republicans managed to maintain their control of the Senate, maintain their control of the U.S. House of Representatives, and won the presidency, Steve Bullock won re-election in a very red state, a state that Donald Trump carried by 20 points. So there are undoubtedly thousands of Trump voters who voted for Steve Bullock. So the question is, will they do that against Steve Daines? Well, the thing is, in Montana, you can sort of, if you kind of try to leap into the mind of a voter here, you can sort of see how Steve Bullock, who's if you're a voter who has approved of the job Steve Bullock has done, as the vast majority of people in Montana do, you might very well trust him to govern your state. However, on the Senate level, you may see him as a threat to Donald Trump, as he could directly obstruct some of the president's agenda. Now, that so far doesn't really seem to be panning out in the polling, although this does clearly appear to be a pretty contested race. This one is going to be a squeaker. A ton of money has been poured into this race pretty early on. The Republicans reserved $10 million in ads in the state. Recently, Steve Daines, a Civics poll from July 11th through the 13th, won a poll there by 2 points, 49 to 47. But up until that point, Bullock had been ahead of him. He had won by 2 in a public policy poll earlier in July, by 4 in one in July, and then one in May that was conducted in April that had him up by 7. So Bullock has the polling lead right now, and this is by all accounts expected to be a Democratic wave year. But here's the thing, though. In the state of Montana, the Senate race for Steve Bullock is a little bit different than what he is used to, because on the Montana level, he is so beloved there. However, voters in the state of Montana, I think, are just as loyal and just as interested in keeping Donald Trump afloat as they are even Steve Bullock afloat. And so that, combined with the fact that, that could, not to mention also that there is data to support the theory that governors who are currently in a governorship position who are running for the Senate do tend to suffer a little bit of a polling deficiency, because there develops almost a little bit of resentment is a strong word, but a little bit of dissatisfaction among voters and constituents who feel that Hey, you're supposed to be doing the actual governing. Why are you spending your time as the governor running for Senate? And so while we don't know if that's going to happen to Steve Bullock, it is worth because there is historical data to back that up. And that combined with Steve Daines winning a recent poll and just the dynamic of the Senate race compared to the state race, I think has me saying that right now this is a tilt Republican. And that's a huge retention for them because, as we know, this is a big Democratic wave year, as we all expect, based on the numbers we're seeing on the generic ballot and in the individual states. Do not be surprised at all if Steve Bullock wins this race. But for now, I think Steve Daines is going to barely squeak this one out. And I think Steve Bullock is definitely running a great race. And by all means, he's the only Democrat, apart from Max Baucus coming back, that could actually win against Steve Daines right now. So this is definitely one to keep a very close eye on. It's basically like, I'm a big sports fan, as you guys know. I often make sports analogies on this channel. It's like a basketball game, and the game is tied right now. But what you sort of have an underlying idea is though one team is just a little bit better and is going to squeak it out. In other words, the game is tied, but Steve Daines is at home. Think of it that way. In the state of South Dakota, Mike Rounds really doesn't have anything to worry about. The Democrats did have a senator here back when they had that gigantic majority in 2008. That senator's mind is escaping me right now. But and of course, Kristi Noem had a tough election in which the Democrat there captured over 47% of the vote. But the South Dakota Democratic Party has a very good reputation nationally. They do very good work there, getting candidates in positions to win races that they really have no business winning. But as of now, Mike Rounds is going to be fine, even if the Democrats are able to put together a pretty good race, which so far there's not really been much noise about them doing. In the state of Nebraska, Ben Sasse, even though he has publicly discussed his dissatisfaction with the direction of the party, he's not going anywhere. He's going to be fine. Now here we go. Here's an interesting one in the state of Kansas. The Kansas Senate primary still hasn't happened, which is remarkable. It's less than 3 weeks away. It's on August 4th, so it's 2 weeks from this coming Tuesday. Chris Kobach is at it again. The guy who lost the gubernatorial race to Democrat Laura Kelly. You have to be a pretty unliked Republican to lose in the state of Kansas. And that's exactly what happened to him, as Laura Kelly was able to defeat him. As we said, that was one of the 7 governorships that flipped from Republican to Democrat. And it was one of the biggest surprises of the entire night. And it was also a little bit of a consolation prize for the Democrats, as they lost a couple emotional gubernatorial races that they had a lot of money poured into and a lot of, again, just sort of emotional attachment invested in, as they lost a close one in Florida, a close one in Georgia, and a close one in Ohio. But should Chris Kobach win this primary, the Democrats might have a shot at this one. Barbara Bollier, is somebody who could defeat Chris Kobach. If Chris Kobach loses in the primary, though, and it's more of a generic sort of, traditional Republican, if you will, that is not good news for the Democrats. And if Kobach wins, the map can be extended into this state, but otherwise it probably won't be. Recently Democratic super PACs have been boosting Chris Kobach, as crazy as that sounds, trying to get him nominated. And so obviously that's a worst case scenario for the Republicans. But should he be nominated, that is going to give the Democrats a chance. Of course, him winning doesn't mean that the Democrats are even necessarily favored, because as we know, he was the nominee in 2018, and it was still a shocking result to see Laura Kelly defeat him. So with all that said, I'm going to put this as a lean right now, because I think Kobach is probably still likely to win this primary right now. It'll be close, but I think he'll squeak this one out. And should that happen, this might get reduced to a tilt. But until that happens, we're going to label this as a lean. But a very interesting Senate race to keep an eye on. Right now, The main pickup opportunities for the Democrats are in Arizona, Colorado, Montana, Iowa, North Carolina, and Maine. Of course, Georgia, you can still throw that in there. I am not as convinced that the Democrats really have a chance to win that seat as many others are. But there are sort of a second tier of seats that the Democrats can target. Georgia being at the forefront there, along with Kansas, should Chris Kobach win. Oklahoma, nothing to discuss here. Jim Inhofe, longtime senator, he's going to be fine. State of Texas. Now, this is obviously one of the more interesting states to dissect in every election right now. Of course, this has been the Republican Party's California for many, many years now. Even though the Democrats have, this is the largest Democratic Party in the country. Which is really interesting considering it's the state of Texas is the largest Democratic presence in the entire country, even more so than in their safe, base states like New York, California, Illinois, among others. Texas has obviously been a very safe Republican stronghold for a long time. That's changing. It's not a safe state anymore. In fact, I'm not even sure it's a likely state anymore. Donald Trump's in trouble in Texas. He is. Even though there were a lot of polls that had him up by 1, by 2, by 3, maybe one that had Joe Biden up by 1 here and there, but you sort of kept thinking, okay, it's still kind of early. Trump is down nationally. He's unpopular. Doesn't mean he's actually going to ultimately lose this. The other day, let's see, I'll pull up the information here. On July 12th, there was a University of Texas at Tyler poll that was released that had Joe Biden up by 5 points. And it was a pretty large sample size also of almost 1,700 voters. That basically officially moved this into the swing state column, which is unbelievable to think about. And should the Republican Party lose Texas on the presidential level, it's over. They have no chance of winning. Now, John Cornyn is not very popular, but he's not facing as stiff a challenge as Ted Cruz faced with Beto O'Rourke. And Texas, of course, is shifting more and more to the left every single year. And it's only a matter of time, if it doesn't happen this time, that a Democrat wins a statewide race or the presidential race. I think it's much more likely that Joe Biden wins than M.J. Hager wins. M.J. Hager was a House candidate from 2018 who lost a race but generated a lot of buzz after some really unique and interesting and compelling campaign ads. Generated quite a bit of money. She ran in a very, very red seat. Managed to flip a lot of voters, made the race a lot closer. And she'll probably do well in this race. I think she'll capture 45% of the vote, but she won't really make it. Beto O'Rourke actually had a chance to win. Whereas M.J. Hager, I don't think realistically is going to be able to defeat John Cornyn. So on the Senate level, I have this as a likely for the Republicans. But again, 3.5 months, there's time for M.J. Hager to make up ground, but I don't think enough time, and she's also just too far behind to actually flip it. State of Minnesota, Tina Smith, earlier on, this was a state that the Democrats were a little bit more worried about than they are now, considering Donald Trump only won it or only lost the state in 2016 by a little over 1 point. It's a lot closer than people expected. But the Democrats had a field day in the midterms here. In 2018, there were 3 statewide races, and they won all 3 of them. Tina Smith easily was able to win to replace Al Franken. She's up again. There's really, I have virtually no reason to believe that that's not going to go that. But just because the state, on the margins can sometimes be a little bit wobbly for the Democrats. I'll label it as unlikely, but it's really a safe state. All right, now in the state of Iowa. This one's pretty interesting as well. This was one that wasn't getting talked about as much as a potential flip opportunity for the Democrats when the election cycle began. Most people knew Colorado was a big target for them, as was Maine, maybe North Carolina, probably Arizona as well. No one was discussing Iowa, but from from early on though, this you could just sort of look at this seat and think to yourself, well, the Democrats could actually win this seat. And sure enough, Joni Ernst is in the election fight of her life against Teresa Greenfield, who recently won the Democratic primary to challenge her. Joni Ernst was somebody who, remember that infamous castration ad um, before she was elected to the Senate. She's now facing a pretty stiff test from Teresa Greenfield, and Teresa Greenfield has since won 4 consecutive polls against her, and the 5th one ago was a tie. So Joni Ernst is behind right now, and a lot of money is now and attention is now being thrown into this race. Joni Ernst was seen as sort of a rising star within the Republican Party, but she's kind of faded from view a little bit, and as such, her approval rating has dipped. And of course, Iowa is such a bizarre state in that, Barack Obama won it both times in 2008 and 2012, and then Donald Trump carried it very easily in 2016. Both senators are Republican, but the Democrats have 3 of the 4 House districts in the state, the 4th of which was up here in the northwest portion of the state where Steve King represented that one from years ago. And of course, he was primaried out some time ago now. And of course, the Republicans also have the governorship. So it's weird how the Democrats won 2 out of the last 3 presidential elections and have 3 of the 4 House seats, but the Republicans have both senators and the governorship. But right now, Teresa Greenfield, I think is in the lead. However, this is a tough one for the Democrats. There's not a big minority population in the state of Iowa, and this just sort of screams of the same thing that happened in the state of Missouri and in Indiana. People forget that leading up to Election Day in the midterms in 2018, Joe Donnelly and Claire McCaskill, who were both neck and neck in the polling, they lost by pretty considerable margins on election night. And that sort of seems like that could happen here to Teresa Greenfield, just because there is, Iowa does carry a certain independent streak, and independents are definitely leaning more Democratic. But right now, Joni Ernst is definitely going to get a big boost from the Republican Party, and Teresa Greenfield, I think, is in for sort of the same thing that happened to Claire McCaskill and Joe Donnelly, and that I think a lot of independents and moderate Republicans that liked them and found them reasonable and went across party lines for them just won't for an incumbent. Just won't for someone who isn't an incumbent, rather, like Teresa Greenfield. And so even though she's ahead in the polls, and it's definitely a major pickup opportunity for the Democrats, I basically have the same thing happening here that I did in Montana. The Democrats are actually, they might be in the lead in both of these states right now, but, if you just sort of imagine where this is going to go on election night, I think this is actually going to end up in the Republican Party's favor. So while they've already lost 2 seats here in Colorado and Arizona, this is pretty damn significant here between hanging on to Montana and Iowa. Now in the state of Arkansas, we're not even going to discuss that one. The Democrats didn't even field a candidate there. Nothing to discuss, and now the Republicans, just as we go through it with 19 Senate seats left, have the lead 41-40. Louisiana, same thing. Bill Cassidy will be just fine. State of Illinois, Dick Durbin is a very, very popular senator. Of course, he's part of the leadership. Illinois is a safe Democratic state. He's going to be fine. Excuse me. In the state of Mississippi, now this one's a little bit more interesting because Mississippi has a very high minority population, as we know. Mike Espy ran in 2018 against Cindy Hyde-Smith, who was in a lot of hot water for some rather racially charged comments that she made. Mike Espy's running again after running a pretty good race. Won 46% of the vote down there. He's running again, challenging Cindy Hyde-Smith the second time around. I think this is going to be a closer race than people think because this is a very high minority population. And again, without making a political statement, African Americans in America are pretty fired up right now. And they, as we all know, overwhelmingly favor the Democratic Party. And so that, combined with an extremely unpopular presidential incumbent and a pretty unpopular senator like Cindy Hyde-Smith, you're seeing how that's kind of becoming a theme here amongst Republican incumbents. I think has this as a lean right now because I think Cindy Hyde-Smith, just by nature of this is still a very red state, will pull this one out. Now in the state of Alabama, for Doug Jones, of course, he was able to defeat Roy Moore in that stunning special election. Doug Jones, very moderate Democrat, a very, very respected guy amongst all parties. A guy who, of course, he's known for prosecuting the 16th Street church bombing perpetrators. Now, Jeff Sessions notably lost this primary by 21 points as Tommy Tuberville blew him away. Tommy Tuberville has as much political experience as I do, meaning he has none. And he's, of course, the former Auburn football coach. And so right now, though, he's quite ahead of Doug Jones. And so right now I have this as a likely for the Republicans. That's a big flip for them. And so they're mostly getting the results they want because they kind of knew they were going to lose out here in Colorado. Arizona is a tough loss for them, but that's, still only a net one for the Democrats. And as remember, they need 4 seats at a minimum if Joe Biden wins the presidency. If he loses, they need 5, and now they've lost one. They've lost their incumbent here in Alabama. They've flipped 2 out here, so that's a net +1, but they've lost opportunities in Montana and Iowa. So time's kind of running out for the Democrats in this model. State of Tennessee, Democrats aren't going to get this one here either. This one has shifted to the right in recent years. The Republicans will be fine there. Now, Mitch McConnell's facing a pretty tough test, actually, here in Kentucky. Amy McGrath is a fundraising superstar, was able to survive a tougher than expected primary challenge from the far more progressive Charles Booker. But Amy McGrath, who was personally recruited by Chuck Schumer to challenge Mitch McConnell, there was a poll the other day or just yesterday, in fact, that had McGrath down only 4 points to McConnell. So it's worth keeping just a little bit of an eye on. As McConnell's going to be fine, but it's worth discussing just because McGrath is such a fundraising superstar. And again, I would normally label this safe, but because she's a very, very good candidate and because Republicans are in such a bad position in terms of popularity nationwide, I'm going to label it. And of course, Mitch McConnell is a deeply, deeply unpopular senator in his own state. I have this as a likely instead of a safe. Now in Michigan, another interesting one because this was, of course, this was sort of ground zero at the 2016 election, one of the more shocking flips that Donald Trump made. Of course, he flipped Wisconsin, he flipped Pennsylvania as well, but in Michigan, he won by 2.27 percentage points. And Debbie Stabenow in 2018 was seen, because Trump won in 2016, Debbie Stabenow was seen as a vulnerable Democratic incumbent in 2018. But she won. She defeated John James, one of the few black Republican candidates, and Debbie Stabenow won in 2018. Now, John James is running again, this time against the other senator, Gary Peters. Gary Peters is not as well known nationwide as Debbie Stabenow, but is just as popular in his own state, and that's really all that matters for Gary Peters. And he continues to lead John James considerably in the state of Michigan. Now, John James might get a little bit of a lift just because he's a well-known candidate and he is expected to speak at the Republican National Convention, and that might give him just a little bit of a jolt in popularity. But right now, Gary Peters, I think, should be fine, especially considering this was one of those states where the governorship flipped for the Democrats, and it was not a close race, as Gretchen Whitmer won her race for the governorship. So even though the margin might not line up this way, I have this as a likely Democratic retention just because of this is a big Democratic wave year. Gary Peters is very popular and routinely leads John James by double digits. Now in the state of Georgia, this is kind of a disappointing state for the Democrats and a very reassuring state for the Republicans because, as we know, Brian Kemp won a very controversial election in 2018, and even so with some built-in advantages. That those aren't my words. Those are the words of all election officials in and out of the state. That was built in for the Republicans. Stacey Abrams still came pretty close and captured 48% of the vote. In the Georgia Senate special election, there's nothing to discuss there. Doug Collins is going to win that seat. In fact, I'm going to label that safe just because it's pretty possible that when this goes to a runoff, that it could be 2 Republicans on the ballot. It's quite possible the Democrats won't even have a chance at that seat. But in the normal election here, Jon Ossoff is the candidate here, which is a little disappointing for the Democrats because this kind of screams for the Democrats having a young black progressive candidate like Stacey Abrams. And instead, they fielded John Ossoff, who was at the scene of the most expensive House race in U.S. history. He's sort of doing what MJ Hager's doing out here in Texas. Somebody who generated a lot of buzz on the House level, but ultimately lost. And so he's actually polling pretty well. He won one poll by 1 point against David Perdue not that long ago, but recently he's been down by 3 in one, down by 5 in another. So I think David Perdue's going to be okay. Right now, I have this as a lean. This could change because this is a state that's shifting leftwards slowly but surely, and of course Joe Biden has a real chance to win this state, just as he does in Texas. But right now, I have this as a lean for David Perdue. Now in South Carolina, we're kind of seeing a similar thing to what we're seeing in Kentucky, as Lindsey Graham, one of the most well-known Republican senators. He is being challenged by Jamie Harrison, former head of the South Carolina Democratic Party, who set a fundraising record in the month of June, raising almost $14 million, which is an outrageous number. So Jamie Harrison's going to have quite a bit of money to play with in this election. And the Democratic Party is a little bit understated in the state of South Carolina. Of course, this is, where Joe Cunningham is, where Jim Clyburn is, and, high minority population as well. And Lindsey Graham, not a very popular guy. Democratic wavier, a guy in Jamie Harrison who's extremely big with the fundraising. So I think that Lindsey Graham is in for a tough fight here. And I wouldn't be surprised to see, especially after Henry McMaster was only able to win about 54% of the vote in his gubernatorial election, I would expect Jamie Harrison to do about the same thing. I think this is kind of an understated race right now. And it's kind of similar to me to what we saw from Beto O'Rourke. I'm not saying it's going to, because as I said, I think Beto O'Rourke actually had a real chance to win, whereas I'm not sure Jamie Harrison really is going to be able to pull this out. But I think he'll be closer than people think. And so I have this as a lean right now for Lindsey Graham. All right, now in the state of North Carolina, this is a big flip opportunity for the Democratic Party. Thom Tillis, the first-term incumbent, is running against Cal Cunningham. Kind of a surprise that Cunningham ultimately became the candidate for the Democrats because, this also, like Georgia, is a state with a very high minority population, and you figured this could be a state where the Democrats would field a candidate like that. But strangely enough, over the years, the candidates that the Democrats have had the most success with are white men: Roy Cooper, John Edwards, and then of course Kay Hagan, a white woman. But now it's Cal Cunningham, and he is in a dead heat against Thom Tillis, but he's recently gotten a surge in the polling, and he currently leads Thom Tillis by a respectable margin, one that it shouldn't make Thom Tillis fear the absolute worst necessarily, but enough. He's there's been quite a bit of money thrown into this race. Tillis himself raised about $8 million in the month of June. The most recent poll from Change Research, added on July 15th, has Cunningham up by 7 points. That's pretty significant. Another one by 8, another one by 10, a tie, another one by 2, another by 3, by 9, by 4, by -1, +2. So you can tell Cunningham has a real shot at this seat. And I think he's the one who's leading it right now. And in a Democratic wavier, Roy Cooper, by the way, a very popular governor, one of the most popular governors in the country, is up for re-election. That meaning he's on the ballot, and that's going to help Cal Cunningham. And in an election year where there's boosted turnout from the presidential level, combined with Roy Cooper being on the ballot, I think Cal Cunningham is going to win this Senate seat, and that is a huge win for the Democratic Party because they were basically running out of time. But to get this seat means that they really now have a chance to reach that 50 threshold, as that's now their third flip of the evening, having lost in Montana and Iowa, and then also a little bit more expected, but still losing in Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina, and winning in Colorado and Arizona. But so now they get North Carolina, that's their third flip of the night, and that gives them a real chance now to reach that 50 mark. Now, in the state of Virginia, Mark Warner, I think he's going to be fine. Okay, this was for a long time a safe Republican state. No longer. It's now a real Democratic state. Mark Warner is going to be just fine. Popular guy, well-known Democrat. He's going to be fine. Nothing for them to worry about there. Of course, the Republicans have 49 seats right now, so they only need one more seat to make it all the way there. But as seeing as you guys are smart enough to probably look ahead on the map here, but it's hard to see where those are going to come from. Now, one of them is definitely going to come here in West Virginia. Shelley Moore Capito is not going to lose, as this was one of the most lopsided states on the presidential level in 2016. So there they go. Now they're at 50, having won in Montana and Iowa, but losing in North Carolina, Arizona, and Colorado. So the Democrats have to go 5 for 5 the rest of the way, 6 for 6 rather, the rest of the way, to even it up. But fortunately for them, we're starting in Delaware. We're not even going to discuss that. New Jersey, Cory Booker, enough said. That's a safe seat. Rhode Island, Jack Reed is going to be fine. An interesting state to watch just because they could lose an electoral vote based on the census, but that's 3 seats right here in the northeastern portion of the state of the country that the Democrats are going to win easily. Now in Massachusetts, it's unknown yet who the Democrat is going to be, whether or not it's going to be longtime senator and reliable Democratic senator, just from the voting perspective, Ed Markey. He's being challenged by Joe Kennedy in the primary, and right now it looks like Joe Kennedy's going to win. But either way, it's going to be a safe Democratic state. Of course, there is a Republican governor of the state of Massachusetts, just as there is in Maryland, just as there is in Vermont, just as there is in New Hampshire, but a very moderate Republican. And of course, Scott Brown years ago did manage to win here, but right now it's a safe Democratic state, especially on the presidential level. Now, in New Hampshire, of course, this is a swing state by most accounts. This was the closest state in 2016. And a state in which Chris Sununu is the governor, and the Republicans were a little disappointed to learn that Sununu was not their candidate for the Senate. Now, he could be in 2022 when Maggie Hassan, who's going to be a vulnerable Democratic senator, is up for re-election. Maggie Hassan won her Senate race by 0.1% when she was elected to the Senate. Now, Chris Sununu, a popular, well-known Republican governor, could definitely defeat her. But right now, the other senator, Jeanne Shaheen, is up for re-election, and the Republicans did not field a notable Republican. So that gives me a lean characterization for Jeanne Shaheen. And so here we are. The entire Senate control now basically rests, because I think that Joe Biden right now is going to win the vice presidency. I can only do one or the other, but that means that the Senate control basically rests with this seat. If the Republicans win, they go to 51 to 49. If the Democrats win, they're at 50-50, and they have the vice presidency. So let's break it down. Susan Collins has gone from being the most popular Republican senator, the most popular senator, period, rather, in the United States, to the most unpopular. And a lot of it has had to do with her siding with Donald Trump on basically every issue. Including, I think, the last straw for a lot of Maine voters was the confirmation of Brett Kavanaugh. Maine is going to go blue on the presidential level. In fact, it's even possible that the district that votes for Donald Trump, that splits the vote, could go for Joe Biden. Angus King is who has endorsed Susan Collins in the past, is not doing so this time. Sarah Gideon, the Democratic Speaker of the House for the state of Maine, is challenging her and is beating her right now in the polls, is raising a lot of money and is defeating her. And I think Susan Collins, while very resilient, is in the political fight of her life. She has not had an election this close since her first ever election years and years and years ago. So Sarah Gideon right now, as a result, I think is going to win this race, and I think has it as a lean characterization right now. And so the Democrats, while there was some disappointment for them in Iowa and Montana, and to a lesser extent in Georgia, they got what they needed, and they got what they wanted, which was 4 flips in the state of Arizona, Colorado, North Carolina, and Maine. And again, this is not necessarily what's going to happen, as I think that in Montana, if the election were today, Steve Bullock would win. And if the election were today, I think Teresa Greenfield would win. But here we go, 50-50, a pretty fascinating election cycle as the Democrats lose in Alabama, where the Republicans are able to flip 1 seat there, but they lose in Arizona. Mark Kelly, John Hickenlooper in Colorado, Cal Cunningham wins in North Carolina, and Sarah Gideon wins in Maine. So thank you guys so much for watching. I know this is another long video. If you have not already, be sure to hit that subscribe button and like button, and please comment down in the suggestions below Anything you may want me to touch on, if there's something in your state that you want me to get to, please do, and I will be sure to make a video to do just that. So again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in November.